phone call from the dead. Sara sat in her dimly lit living room, curled up on the couch. The soft glow of a candle flickered beside her, casting long shadows on the walls. It had been 2 weeks since her father, James, passed away. The grief was still raw, gnawing at her heart with each passing day. Her eyes were heavy, tears threatening to spill as she stared at his old picture frame resting on the coffee table. His smile was comforting, but it only made her ache more. The silence in the room was interrupted by the sudden, jarring sound of her phone vibrating. Sara hesitated. She glanced at the screen, and her heart froze in her chest. The caller ID showed only one name, Dad. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone, her mind racing. This can't be real. She stared at the screen in disbelief. Her father's phone number was calling her. Her breath caught in her throat. He was gone. She had seen him buried, heard the dirt thud against his coffin. Without thinking, Sara answered the call. Hello? Her voice was barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, she heard a faint rustling on the other end. It sounded like someone trying to clear their throat. Her heart raced, and she squeezed her eyes shut. Then, the voice came through. His voice, but it was distorted, like static through a broken speaker. Sara? The voice sounded strained, but it was unmistakably her father's. Dad, she whispered, her voice cracking. Is it really you? There was a long pause. She could hear something in the background, whispers, or was it wind? The voice on the phone came again, now slower, more deliberate. I'm here, sweetheart. I didn't want to leave you. Sara's blood ran cold. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It was too familiar, too much like him. But there was an edge to it. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. Dad, where are you? How is this even happening? Sara asked, her voice shaking. She felt a growing sense of dread in the pit of her stomach. Something about the call was wrong. It wasn't the same. The voice on the other end chuckled softly, but the sound was wrong. It wasn't the warm, comforting laugh she remembered. It was too low, too hollow. I'm right here, Sara, the voice whispered. You don't need to worry about me. I never left. Sara's fingers began to shake uncontrollably. She stood up and walked to the window, peering outside into the dark street. It was empty, but the house felt heavier now. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, stretching toward her. She looked back at her phone, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Dad, please, this isn't funny. She stopped mid-sentence. The voice was no longer her father's. It was something deeper, something darker, something that didn't belong. I'm not your father, the voice growled, sending a chill down her spine. It was low, guttural, like something that didn't belong in the world of the living. But I know everything about you, Sara. Her body stiffened. What do you want from me? She whispered, her throat dry. She could hear the breathing on the other end, heavy and labored, like something was standing right behind her. The hairs on her neck prickled. You should have never answered the call, Sara, the voice whispered. You belong to me now. Sara's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move. She dropped the phone onto the couch, her eyes wide with fear. The voice on the other end continued, growing louder and more distorted, now mixing with faint whispers that sounded like they were coming from inside the walls. Her hands scrambled to grab the phone, but it slipped from her grasp. The room felt cold, the air thick with something she couldn't see, but it was suffocating, pressing against her chest. She backed up slowly toward the door, her breathing quick and shallow. Suddenly, the phone rang again. This time, the screen showed her father's number once more. She nearly jumped out of her skin, panic rising in her chest. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. Something was here now, in the house with her. "Don't answer it," she muttered to herself, shaking her head as she backed into the corner. But the phone kept ringing. The whispers grew louder, now clearer. They were behind her. Against every instinct, Sara grabbed the phone. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. But the moment she said his name, the voice on the other end didn't reply in words. Instead, a horrible, distorted laugh rang through the phone, deep and chilling. The laugh echoed in the walls around her, amplifying until it was all she could hear. "I warned you, Sara," the voice hissed. "You can't escape me." She slammed the phone down, but it kept ringing, the same number, the same voice, louder. And then, in the silence that followed, she heard something else, footsteps, slow, dragging steps. Sara's heart pounded in her chest as she turned around, her eyes searching the dark corners of the room. The shadows shifted, moving in ways they shouldn't. The temperature in the room plummeted, her breath visible in the air as she backed up into the corner. "It's here," she thought, her stomach twisting. The footsteps were louder now, approaching her. But when she turned to the doorway, she saw nothing. There was no one. Her breath hitched in her throat as the hairs on her arms stood on end. She heard the phone ringing again. This time, it was coming from somewhere else, deeper in the house, coming from the kitchen. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her eyes darted from the phone, back to the doorway, and then to the shadows in the hallway. The air grew thick with an unnatural force, as if the house itself was alive, watching her. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone one last time. Holding it to her ear, her body frozen in terror. The voice, now unmistakably dark and malevolent, spoke again. "You should have never answered the phone, Sara. You invited me back, and now, I am coming for you." Suddenly, the phone call cut off. The room fell into an eerie silence. Sara stood still, the phone still pressed to her ear, the weight of the words echoing in her mind. But the silence didn't last long. From the other side of the room, Sara saw it. A shadow, dark and distorted, moving in the corner. And then, the phone began to ring again, this time with a terrifying sound. It wasn't a ring anymore. It was a scream, a horrible, screeching wail, as if someone, or something, was calling out in agony. The figure in the corner of the room stepped forward, and Sara's blood ran cold. The shape was no longer human. It was her father's face, but not his face, contorted, eyes black and hollow, smiling as it reached out toward her. Her body screamed to run, but she couldn't. Her legs wouldn't move. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The phone continued to scream in her ear, a relentless, unearthly noise, as the figure closed in. In the final moment, before everything went black, she heard one last whisper, so close it made her skin crawl. "You answered, and now you're mine." The screen goes dark,